Hey, um, thanks, Damien, and everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. It's a fascinating um, conference and one which I think is very worthwhile with regards to the elements of the archaeology that are surviving in the country. But just to speak a little about my own project, I've named the Documenting and Recording Wexford's War of Independence, and it's essentially looking at the period in County Wexford, but it's taking an archaeological approach. And it began towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And I suppose a bit of background to the project first. I became interested in the period from, I remember in 2016, there was great celebrations in County Wexford, particularly in Enniscorthy, with regard to it being one of only a few places to see action outside of Dublin. And there was a lot of emphasis in particular on local projects and finding out about the stories and the events that took place around the county. And moving on from this, the next, I suppose, big event to look forward to, or the commemoration of, was the War of Independence. And I started reading to see was there much that went on in the county at the time, and I found that there wasn't much activity, or rather that it was stated that there wasn't much activity in the county. I just have a quote there from one historian, Marie Coleman, in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, and she goes, "Indeed, one of the most surprising aspects of the conflict in the province of Leinster was the relatively low level of activity in Wexford, in light of the county's significant role in 1916 and the strength of its republican tradition in 1798. So they had, between this view of some historians and the kind of void in the literature with regard to the period in Wexford, it would make you think that very little well done. But I found when I was started to research the period that, on the contrary, actually there was quite a lot of activity, not on the same level with regard to some counties such as Tipperary and Cork, but nonetheless quite a lot of activity, particularly on a local level. And from this, I decided to start the project, and I suppose it had three main aims, really. The first was to create awareness of the period in the county through its archaeological remains. Wexford is very well attributed to 1798, and there's nearly not a crossroads or parish you can drive through without seeing some sort of memorial to an event or a person from the area or the place where an incident occurred. So the idea of this was to sort of create awareness on a local scale, in particular, of the events that took place in the county. As well as this, to document and record any archaeological remains from the period, and to disseminate the information online via social media and a dedicated website. So just quickly to run through the methodology of this, the first thing I had to try and figure out well was what went on in Wexford during the time. And the valuable resources this has been the brigade activity files. You can see them there on the left-hand side. County Wexford was broken into a North Brigade and a South Brigade. And there's two separate activity files for this. And these were essentially compiled in conjunction with the pension, or the administration of the pension applications. And they contain a list of activities for each brigade area in the country, together with the people who were involved. And from this, I was able to compile a list of various activities, ambushes, raids, executions, attacks on barracks, and so on. And I supplemented this detail with information from the witness statements and local newspapers to try and create an accurate account as possible of each of these events. From that to date, I have a provisional list compiled. You can see out there on the left-hand side, and it consists of a total of 24 RIC barracks which are burned, 11 incidents of ambushes, 2 big houses that were destroyed, 3 Coastguard stations burned, 2 courthouses destroyed, and 8 instances of attacks on barracks. And once I had compiled a list of activities, I went about seeing what survived, what elements associated with these survive today. So I did a mix of desktop assessment and site visits, and a majority of this was undertaken during the COVID lockdown. So I was restricted to where I could go, but I found Google Street View was an invaluable tool during this time. You can see on the bottom right hand of the screen, this is a picture of Federal RIC Barracks, which was burned in 1920. And it was great to be able to see what elements of the period survive within the county. And then the information has been disseminated, as I said, online and via social media in the form of small articles that give the historical background to the event and with particular emphasis on the archaeological remains. And I'm just going to go through now a couple of the elements that survive in the county and what the research to date has found. And one of the more striking or interesting aspects of this I found is the surviving RIC barracks, a total of 24, which were burned in the county in 1920, and they survive in various different states. Some of them are now private residents, have been reused as Garda stations. Others are in complete ruin, and others have no trace of these surviving at all. And you can see the distribution of these on the left-hand side of the screen. Some examples we're lucky to have photographic evidence associated with their destruction from local newspapers. You can see an example here of an RIC barracks which had been vacated in Ballyrankin that was sabotaged in 1920. This avoided the destruction of being burned because it was an adjoining building. So I suppose the local IRA company were aware of the possibility of the fire spreading. But you can see the damage there that had been done to the building. The roof was had holes placed inside it, damage to the doors and windows. And this below is an example of the building as it looks today. So very much identical from the period. And the distribution of these barracks, many of them in rural areas, they're really a local link to the period for many communities. And there's great possibilities of what can be done here with regards to interpretation and dissemination of the information. Another example or a particular favourite of mine is Clonavon Barracks. You can see a photograph here on the left-hand side of after it was burned in 1920 by the local Ferns RIC company. It was later rebuilt and used as a guard station up until the 1970s and is now private residence. And it's also for sale at the moment for a cool price of 300,000 if anyone is looking to own a piece of history. Well, it's located at a rural crossroads, and it's one of these barracks which is a listed building. So this gives it some protection into the future with regards to its preservation. Another fantastic example of which there's no trace of surviving actually is Tintern Barracks. This is a photograph taken after its destruction in May 1920. And there's an interesting story behind this with regard to, it was one of two barracks that was still occupied, not by the RIC, but by the family of what would have been the acting sergeant. And on the night of their destruction, the IRA asked them to vacate the house and the buildings, but they were very kind to the family and took out their furniture and belongings. And you can see them scattered outside in the front of the buildings here now with the empty shell of the barracks behind them, and together with the sergeant and his children out the front. And this is what the site looks like today. There's no trace or evidence of the former building on the site. But interestingly, across the way, just from where this photograph was taken, you can see or you can't see, but is the entrance to Tintern Abbey, an OPW run site which receives a large number of visitors every year, as well as the Coastguard Wall Gardens and other walks down there. So it's quite a visited and passed by location. And again, there's an opportunity here to disseminate the information to people visiting the area. Another example of a ruined barracks is located in Killinick, which is just between Ross and Wexford town. And this is an interesting example because when I first went to look for it on Google Street View, there was no sign of it at all. The exterior had been completely covered by vegetation, but it wasn't until I actually visited the site that I actually found there's actually very substantial remains surviving. And there's a fantastic description of the building given in the Irish Examiner from documents that were found on the person of a local IRA volunteer whose company had actually scouted the building, and they describe it. This was in July July 1920, they scouted the building and they found that it was fortified with steel shutters, sandbags, and the only instance in the county where I found what referred to as bombing holes, which were excavated from inside and just a shell of mortar left on the outside, and the holes were about 2.5 feet deep. And the idea being that these could be utilized in the event of an attack. And also, which was very nice to see the remains of one of the actual steel shutters protruding from one of the ledges of the upper, or the sills, pardon me, of the upper windows. Now, as well as structural remains, buildings, there's also the sites of ambushes, and one particular ambush of note, it's not famous with regards to any casualties or anything like that, but it's significant in that it was the first ambushed by the North Wexford flying column in the county. And the descriptions state that it took place in the townland of Munfin. Now, this is quite a large townland, and it takes in a large stretch of the N80, the main Bunclody to Enniscorthy Road. The area is roughly this here, and the descriptions describe it as being taken place a mile from Ballycarney. Again, very hard to pinpoint, and especially as the road has undergone much change in recent years. But the one description which really helps nail it down is the fact that it says that took place by the White Woman's Hollow. Now, I grew up very close to this area, just on the other side of the river, and it was something that completely escaped me growing up here. I never knew of the event or indeed of the White Woman's Hollow. And it wasn't until I asked around locally, there were some members of the community that were able to help locate the general area. And we went searching one day, and as you can see, this is the site of it today, and it's very hard to find any description of a hollow in the ground. There's reference to it in the Folklore Commission actually as being a haunted location where a white woman would appear at night on a horse, and still to date there's people who recall cycling past it very, very quickly at night for fear of meeting this lady. But it wasn't until we were at the other opposite end of the Slaney actually looking that you could see that it still survives the visible in section. You can see that the ground suddenly drops down and rises up. And from this, then we were able to put the information together and kind of create an illustration of the event and how it would have taken place. One particular thing we got from this, from looking at it, was that the location of the IRA column seems to be not great with regards to escaping. They're kind of cut off here from the river. But again, local knowledge kind of helped us understand that this is actually a very shallow point. You can see an island here as well. And the existence of former field boundaries, which are now non-existent, would have helped mask any or hide any retreat from the time at the time. Another ambush site which has surviving elements is in Folks Mills, a small village in South County Wexford. And on the 19th of March 1921, 4 RIC constables were ambushed entering Furlong's shop. And the accounts from the time state that the attackers flung a bomb from behind a tree which was located outside the store. And of course, if you visit the site here today, you can see from a Google Map image that tree is still surviving. So it's a physical element or a link to that period still existing in a prominent location within the community. I referred to the big houses that were burned in County Wexford during the period. There was it's sort of a precursor to the large-scale destruction that took place in the Civil War in the county. The first big house to be burned was Ballyrankin House, home of the Screen family. This is one of the only 2 surviving photographs of the building, built in the early 1800s, quite a large mansion, 2-story with a basement and stables and outhouses attached. And this is the ruins of it today. It was burned in July 1920 as a reprisal for the burning of a local volunteer's home in Crummogue across the river. And you can see it's in although it's in ruin, visiting the site, which is on private land, and thank the owner for giving me access to this, still gives us, you can still get a scale of the grandeur of what was a large country mansion at the time. And if you go inside, you can still see physical elements of the burning of the building that night. You can see the scorched roof, trusses, timbers, and all that scattered the inside of the building. Another element which is existing along the coastline, in particular Wexford being a coastal county, is a total of 4 Coastguard stations which were either burned or raided during the period. And the 3 which were burned were Killinick, Morris Castle and Barrack. Some of these sites I visited. If you visit Barrack in the south of the county, there is unfortunately not a trace of the Coastguard station surviving today. This is a photograph taken in the late 1990s of the building, and it's the only surviving photograph I'm aware of its ruins before it was completely demolished in the early 2000s. But there are other elements surviving. We have the boathouse from the period, as well as the remains of a nice slipway leading down into the sea, and the boundary wall which survives the site. But this is just the local site where it was also raided and attacked by the IRA at least twice, and is almost forgotten about. Another Coastguard station was at Killinick, located just north of Coady. Quite a busy town. It's located on a nice actual coastal walk, so quite a few people have passed this place and probably not realised that that's another link to the revolutionary period or the War of Independence in the county. You can see it contains elements of earlier defensive elements, gun loopholes, and it was actually rebuilt in the early, not only several years ago, and it now acts as a guest house. And it's another one of these sites which are in prominent locations, which receive a lot of visitors, and where there is opportunity to disseminate the information, or I suppose make people aware of the history of this site and this building. There were numerous attacks on RIC barracks throughout the county Wexford. Probably the best surviving example of an RIC barracks is that at Folk Mills. This was attacked numerous times, first on December 1920. The barracks was subsequently burned actually during the Civil War, but you can see in the descriptions it was heavily fortified. This account was given by Thomas Howlett. I won't go through the entire thing, I'm just conscious of time, but it describes the building as having 2 windows in the front on the ground floor. These had steel shutters with loopholes. In the ground floor, the gable ends had loopholes, but no windows. And as part of the defensive arrangements, barbed wire had been placed on all sides of the barracks, from the eaves to the ground, and extending about 8 feet from the base of the building. This is the building as it survives today. Although you can't see it in the front on the image, but the front of the building is peppered with bullet holes, probably associated from the numerous attacks during that period. And also on each gable we have the concrete loopholes still in existence. So it's a beautiful example of a rural RIC barracks in the county. And again, it's one of these places where there's opportunity for a local community to get engaged. Another example of an attack on an RIC barracks, but for which there is no trace surviving, is at Ferns. This is a picture of the main street taken in the 1970s, and you can see what was left of the building on the left-hand side, the 2-story building. This is one of the only photographs we have of it, actually. Was a very prominent building, important in 1916. It was occupied by the local volunteers from the Coady when they occupied the town for several days. And it was attacked on several occasions during the War of Independence. Again, we can use old photographs to get an idea of the structure of the building. This is this local schoolhouse, which was next door to it. What's now the Courtyard Bar and Restaurant. We can see it had a hit roof, and in the descriptions of it, they obviously learned from attacks such as in Folk Mills and Clonroach, where they threw bombs on top of the roof in an attempt to try and create holes through which they could throw other bombs onto the garrison inside. But there's a description of netting being placed over the roof to try and combat this. We were able to map the various locations from which or positions in which the IRA would have attacked the building, and this is just an example in Ferns of a prominent, what would have been a prominent building right in the middle of the main street that doesn't survive today. It was demolished in the 1990s for the church car park, and they only survive but there are contemporary buildings surrounding it, such as the bar the Courtyard Bar and Restaurant, and also the school. And just where the star is as well, we found a, as everyone remembers of the community, a single bullet hole in one of the window sills, and this is probably the only surviving element, or one of the only physical elements that are visible, probably from one of these attacks on the barracks. Another prominent building that was attacked was New Ross RIC Barracks, and this is just an example of a sketch map, which one of many that is in the South Wexford Brigade activity files, and it makes the job of trying to ascertain the movements of the men and their positions a lot easier. Essentially, this attack took place on the 31st of March. The barracks, which was located on Priory Street, had fire drawn on it from the high ground to the east. And this was to just keep the guys inside and the garrison inside busy while members of B Company ambushed an RIC patrol, which was coming up along the street. They actually failed to show up, but they decided that they would attack the barracks anyway. And it still survives on Priory Street today, and on both gables you can still see loopholes. And I've been told, local historian Miles Courtney very kindly gave me a tour of the town, and said that he has been told how there were particular ranges or distances marked along the street so that they could gauge the distance from which to fire from inside the barracks from these loopholes. Another element of the project is looking at safe houses and training camps. One of these, which particularly stands out from others, is Coady's at Carriseen. It comes up numerous times in the witness statements. This is located in the Blackstairs Mountains. You can see this line here is actually the Carlow and Wexford border. And it was kind of a classical safe house hidden up in the mountains. And it was also used as a general headquarters for the North Wexford Brigade, but also there's references to it being a munitions camp where bombs and grenade castings were made, as well as a training camp. And you can see this is a shot of it looking down from the mountain. Coady's is here, and there's this flat area of moorland which comes up to a rocky outcrop, and from that the mountain rises steeply. But just in amongst these rocky outcrops, a lot of hikers have noticed and forwarded me on information, in particular Michael Monaghan. I'd like to thank him for these photographs. Dry stone walls, which are constructed against many larger stones. You can see an example here, and there's evidence of plaster work on some of these, and it has been suggested that these were maybe hideouts, or maybe where arms would have been hidden. There is memory of galvanized roofs on some of these from some members of the community, but these may be possibly linked to activities at Coady's. We can't say for sure, but if you were to just duck down, you would be well out of sight of any coming any Black and Tans or RIC that were arriving in the area. Another element, how am I doing for time actually? I'll keep going.
A couple of minutes maybe, Barry, if that's all right.
Yep, that's grand. Another element which has been looked at is the site of executions. There were some shootings were accidental, some were on purpose, but one which stands out was the execution of a man by the name of James Doyle. He was accused of being an alleged spy, and his body was found dumped on the Carlow side of the Wexford Carlow border, just along the Blackstairs Mountains. And what stands out in particular from this example is that the field where his remains were found, with a placard saying "Spies and traitors beware, IRA are on your trail," is still known today as the Spy Field. So that the association with that event still lives on in the local place names of the fields. And also just across the river from that location is the alleged location of a burial associated with a local spy who was involved in the Ballymurphy ambush, in which members of the Carlow flying column were nearly decimated just on the other side of the mountain from Coady's. So I suppose the whole point of this project is to create awareness of the elements of the archaeology from the War of Independence in the county. And some of these are more prominent than others. You can see on the left-hand side here is an example of Fettered RIC Barracks, which was burned during the War of Independence, and it takes up a prominent location along the main street. And there's opportunities for community engagements within these aspects. And some of these have been utilized. You can see on the right-hand side, a very, very simple but efficient example where Killinick Development Group have erected a sign just highlighting that the local barracks, which was burned in 1920. Another example with regards to reprisals here, this is located in Courtown. What is now Foxy John's pub was once the location of Etchingham's home and business. Etchingham was a prominent Republican in County Wexford, and it was destroyed as a reprisal. You can see the photograph there on the left-hand side for the Inch ambush in which a Constable Dupree was shot and killed by members of the North Wexford flying column. And when we were the main element which allowed us to identify this site was the actual the fence post along here. You can't see it in the photograph, but this actually extends and curves in. You can see this section here matches what is shown in the photograph. And when we went and spoke to the owner, he had no clue of what had happened there in it at the time, but he was very engaging and willing to, you know, make members of the public aware. So people are very engaging in the county with regards to this history, and it's a very positive outcome for the project. I suppose a part of the historian residence, some of the elements we've done is we've in late last year, October and November, we undertook walking tours of some of the towns of the county, and we visited some of the sites associated with the revolutionary period. And we're pictured here outside of a Methodist church in Coady, where the body of actually Dupree was brought after the Inch ambush. But visiting places like this gives people, I suppose, they associate the physical elements with the events, and people are more prone to share stories. One story which stood out in particular from this tour was that a gentleman stated that he, the reason he was breathing today was because thanks to the help of a doctor, the wife of Percival Lee Wilson, after her husband's assassination in Coady. He was the RIC district inspector who was shot in the summer of 1920 on direct orders from Michael Collins for allegedly mistreating one of the 1916 signatories in Dublin. And she later went on and studied for the medical profession, but she was in Dublin and he found it hard at the time. He was a young child, he got sick, but when she heard that there was a child in need from Coady, she called down straight away, and he, to this day, commends that woman with his life. So it's just interesting story and elements that people will talk about when they're engaging with these physical elements of history. And that's the talk, folks. I hope you've kind of given an idea of some of the various elements surviving in the county, and just that it might maybe encourage other people to look into what else is surviving elsewhere in the country. And it gives an example of a county which often isn't considered to have been very active in the War of Independence, but yet there are multiple surviving elements still in existence throughout. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks very much.